So let's look at this EQ, right? So when you're EQing into distortion, saturation and stuff, it's volume dependent. When you get a guitar distortion, not that I've ever got one and played guitar, if you feed too much into the guitar distortion, the distortion is not going to react how it's supposed to. It's going to sound crap. So you need to be aware of how much you feed into it. And that's the same with distortion in plugin format as well. It's amplitude dependent, I suppose you'd call it. So if I got my output of Serum and just whacked it right up, which I used to do, run it through a distortion, what happens is it just sort of squares it off a bit like a clipper, and you've got no real characteristics of distortion. So first of all, you can think of that, but then you can also think about EQ. So the loudest part of a sound, if it's got a lot of frequency content, would be the low frequencies. So if here's your lid of your distortion, right here, and you're feeding this sick reese through it, but what hits the distortion first is all the low frequencies, because that's the loudest part of the sound. What's the distortion going to react to first? The low frequencies. But you might not want it to react to the low frequencies. This might not be the purpose of it. So imagine the bass is really nice, like, now you run it through a distortion, just go, because the low frequencies are hitting it. So you need to create some space so it's more balanced, yeah? Just think of it like that. You need to bring some of the bass down. So now some of the mids hit it first, and then you get the, and you still keep the bass, but the distortion's reacting to the mids. Making sense? Yeah? So we just really think about this. When you're using distortion, saturation, what's going to hit it? Yeah?
So what do you mean, like, the bass would hit it first?
Right, so...
Wouldn't the sound just hit all at once?
No, because if imagine here's your frequency. How can you explain it? There's a curve that human hearing is, I think it's the Fletcher-Munson curve, like, we don't hear in a flat line. We hear like certain frequencies more. Kind of, it's like this angle. So we have to have subs. Yeah, a dog could hear really low frequencies properly. We can only feel them. That's why we have these crazy ass speakers, and it needs to produce them. So instead of a bass sound being flat, it's like this. It's tilted. So you have a shitload of sub, and it goes down and down and down almost like that. So if that's your tilt going to distortion, yeah, and your mid-range is here, and how can I do it? This is the distortion that where you want it to go to, and we fire some sound through it, and this is your low frequencies, but your mid's here, but really you want your mids to hit the distortion. It's going to be the loudest part of the sound is the sub. Do you get what I'm saying? Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah, yeah. So if we can get rid of some of the sub and bring the mids up, the distortion is going to react to the mids. Makes sense, yeah? Yeah. It's really volume dependent. You could really just get a sine wave and run it through some distortion and see how it sounds. The more you drive it, the distortion will change completely in tone. Yeah, I don't know too much more about it than that. I just use my ears. So we could use an EQ on this, and we can carve out some of the bass that's going to the distortion, which we'll look at towards the end of the chain. Or if we went with all the sub. This is just reacting to the distortion. Make sense? Okay. Then you got a plug-in here called Erosion, which is creating like fuzz and stuff like that to it. Like this. Which is like almost like just a fuzz plug-in in Ableton. You can get like a third-party version of it, whatever. Then it's going to an amp simulator. And at the moment, it's got. I'm just going to use it like this on a dry and wet. Bring that at the top end. Then you've got a saturator, which is essentially like a clipper. So it's different stages of distortion. I won't talk about it too much, but just think of it like a clipper. It's cutting off some of the sound. Then I've used a vocoder just to make the sound. Hold on, I've got sweaty hands. A bit crazy, but that's on a dry and wet as well. And I just sitting and playing with things until we end up going for another saturator to kind of sort of tame some of the peaks. And it's really using my ears. Then I've used this, which is a multiband compressor. I'm not expecting you to understand all this or get it first time because we haven't got too long to it. But this shapes the sound. And with compression, attack and releases are really important because if you have the attack sort of slow, it lets a lot of the sound through, and the release controls how long it's let through, that sort of thing. So this is set in bands. So if I turn this off, I've lost the shape which I created. Yeah, and that's just done by having control of the bands. So there's that. And then I added another chain, which is this one here. And now we've unbalanced things, which is adding more tops. Which, if I went back, and I believe that would be erosion somewhere. It's too much of this. We've lost a lot at the bottom end as well, so I could go back and fix things. I'm not too much worried about this at the moment. Added some different things. Actually, I don't need that one. I'm going to remove that one. And then there's one more here, which is where we start to use like things like OTT. Which has got another saturator, OTT, which is another multi-band. The good thing about OTT, if you've heard of it, have you all heard of OTT? Right. Think of it like this. It's the sound of dance music, or it definitely was for a long time, especially dubstep, and it can be really useful in many different things. It's more of a creative tool than a multi-band compressor. That's the better way of getting your head around it. It has a sound to it. And the reason it has a sound to it is because of the way it splits bands and stuff like that. And yes, it's a compressor and it's upwards and downs and all this waffle, right? I can't get my head around it. Whenever I used it, I thought, this is rubbish. But if you actually forget about that and use it for what it is, which I believe is more of a creative tool, you can use these 3 dials here, which is your output for each band. Load up the preset, because that's what it is, an OTT preset, and use these. So you've got your lows, mids and highs, and you can turn your lows up some, your mids up, and your highs, and rebalance stuff. And it just has a sound to it, and then you've got a dry wet on it. So just try that with OTT and see how you get on. You can put it on 808s, you can put it on drums, you can put it on vocals. Vocals, it sounds absolutely sick. You can really mash stuff up because it makes things sound really aggressive. And yeah.
So it's a third-party plugin, or
So OTT is part of Ableton, but you can get a free version of it via Expo Records. And if you get time, just look into OTT. It's the sound of Skrillex, sound of this, and you can use it on live instruments and all sorts of things. Essentially, what it does is it brings up the bottom of a quiet recording and gets the top and squishes them both together. So say if we recorded this with that mic, if it was plugged in, it would sound mental with loads of OTT on it, because it brings up all the stuff that's really quiet and all the stuff that's super loud and squashes them together. And you would be amazed at what it can do and the effect it has on sound and what it can do with bass and stuff like that. But what I'm trying to show you is just kind of like how you can sort of go from an 808 to some sort of crazy bass and have an understanding of a bit quickly of distortion and so on. Right, so then it's running through an EQ. These delays and phasers aren't really relevant. More distortion, OTT and so on. I'm going to skip through these plugins, and right at the end, just to put a lid on it, it could be a clipper, but I've used this limiter here. And let's go all the way back. I turn this off. Do it this way. We've gone from that to some sort of crunchy, punchy sound. You got to remember, it doesn't sound like too much because it's just one sound, but when you start taking bits of these basses and changing the sounds and rendering them, you end up with the most punchy sounds. You know, if it's just all of your sounds are just consistent boo, you can't just rely on your drums. You need some crack in your basses these days. You need some cracking, you know. It all takes a bit of effort, but a lot of this is to do with what I was saying about distortion, understanding distortion, using a bit of EQ, rebalancing things, sound of OTT, multi-band compression, out comes the other end. Yeah, it sounds easy. Maybe it is, but it's taken me a long time to figure it out. And really, it's trial and error. Makes sense? I'm not expecting you to understand that, but it's just showing you where we've gone from something quite basic to the end result.